Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Faith and Culture conversation this March. My name is Kelly Shipley Cooper, and I serve as the Associate for Program Development and Newcomer Ministries at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. And again, we are just so glad that you are here joining with us tonight. I'm going to introduce our two co-facilitators and then pass things over to one of them to introduce our speaker tonight. But again, for our faith and culture conversations, it is an opportunity for us as a church, as a community, as humans, to discuss important topics and especially discuss how faith and culture intersect with those topics in particular. So tonight, facilitating our conversation is Christine Lucretz Marquis, who is an associate professor of church history at Union Presbyterian Seminary, and also the Master of, what is it, program? I always get this wrong.
Master of Theology.
The Master of Theology Program Director at Union as well. And then Dave Coogan, who is an Associate Professor of Church History, not Church History, I'm really off my game tonight. Associate Professor of English at Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU. So again, Christine and Dave are both parishioners at St. Paul's, and we are so grateful for you all facilitating our conversation. And now I will pass things over to Dave, who will introduce our speaker.
All right, well, everybody, thanks for being here. And I am excited to introduce to you tonight, Rabbi Michael Knopf. He is the spiritual leader of Temple Beth-El in Richmond, Virginia, one of the region's oldest and largest Jewish congregations. Rabbi Knopf is recognized as a leader within and outside the Jewish community. He is named one of Richmond's 40 under 40 in 2017, and he was invited by Governor Northam to offer the benediction at his inauguration and to preside over the first ever interfaith Passover Seder at Virginia's Executive Mansion. He is the co-founder of Richmond Jews for Justice, a member of Leadership Metro Richmond, and he serves on the boards of Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy and the Jewish Community Foundation of Richmond, and helps to lead several local interfaith groups. Welcome, Rabbi Knopf.
Well, thank you so much. It's so great to be here.
Well, we are so excited to have this conversation with you this evening. So I'm going to start with sort of our usual sort of broad question. Can you describe for us what you know about your faith and how you came to know it?
Yeah, I always feel like this question is a little boring in a room filled with Christians, because my Christian friends, tend to have very dramatic experiences of faith. So I was born into a Jewish family. And one of the quirks of Judaism, as many people probably know, is that religion is only a part of what it means to be Jewish. For some people who identify as Jews, it's a very small part or non-existent part of what it means to be Jewish. So that means that being Jewish is about belonging to a people as much as it is practicing a particular faith. So I was born to a Jewish family, a Jewish family that was, I think, on the spectrum of things, somewhat pretty involved in Jewish life and in and somewhat practicing of Jewish faith and tradition. So that means, in the kind of spectrum of American Jews, it means we belong to a synagogue. We attended that synagogue not infrequently, although not frequently. We kept a home. At our home, we observed the Jewish dietary laws and celebrated Jewish holidays, but generally speaking, didn't observe the Sabbath in a traditional way, which is one of the markers of traditional Jewish observance. My grandparents were a little bit more involved in Jewish life than my parents were in some ways. My grandfather was the president of our congregation, which is a volunteer position, but was something that he was very proud of and involved with when I was growing up. My siblings and I went to a Jewish day school growing up, which is a dual curriculum school of Judaics and general studies. And so I attended a school like that from kindergarten through 8th grade. My siblings actually went on through high school, but I didn't, for reasons that I can maybe share later that may or may not be interesting. but in terms of the question of my faith, that's actually a piece of it, because I was a very still am in many ways, very inquisitive person, very I had kind of a rebellious streak, and have a kind of healthy dose of skepticism. And so, in my dual curriculum school, we would learn things like there's an aspect of traditional Jewish faith that says, God authored the entirety of the Torah, which is the sacred text of Jewish tradition, and that we mark our time in a kind of traditional way by a calculation of rabbinic tradition, reading the chronology of the Torah, to say that that would place us, if you take as literal that there were 7 days of creation, that would place us around the year 5,782 is where we are this year. And I was in science class, and I was learning about, dinosaurs and other, kind of geological things. And I said to one of my Judaic teachers, I said, we're learning about dinosaurs in science class, and, that they lived 65, 75, 100 million years ago. But you have said that the world is less than 6,000 years old. So, which is right? And he said to me, God put dinosaur fossils in the ground to test our faith. And I said, I didn't say to him, detention, but I said to myself, if that's what traditional Jewish belief is, then it's really not for me. And so it took me some time to kind of make my way back to Jewish belief and Jewish practice. I found my way back when I was in high school, actually as a dimension of my rebellious streak. My parents were not particularly religious, as I said, and so a way to kind of assert my own independence and identity, I was going to embrace Judaism. I decided, unlike my siblings, that I was not going to go to a Jewish high school. So I went to a prep school with a Christian heritage, and a way to kind of rebel against the school that I chose to go to. I was going to embrace Judaism, and I found an approach to Judaism in the denomination that I now affiliate with, which is actually the denomination of the synagogue that I grew up in, conservative Judaism, which is somewhat of a misnomer. Conservative Judaism believes in having a disposition of embracing the received tradition while also being mindful of contemporary insights and the recognition that tradition has always changed over time. And so it's kind of like a historical mindset in viewing the tradition. And importantly for me, it was an approach to the tradition, to Jewish tradition, that was very open to the world and involved in the world. And so I saw in that, through some teachers and some mentors that I had when I was in high school, a way of embracing my faith that also was deeply involved and concerned about the world. And so that has, from that time on, been one of the core components of my faith and my practice, is a Judaism that cares about what's going on in the world, that is invested in what's going on in the world, and that is committed to what we call in Judaism repairing the world, or tikkun olam in Hebrew. So that's kind of both the story of my understanding of my faith. I think that the way I understand my faith now is that the essence of it is tikkun olam, is repairing the world, is being involved in causes of social justice and human uplift, human dignity, and that the practices of Judaism, which I embrace in a fairly traditional way, are kind of methods of holding those values, or kind of containers of holding those values and passing them on to the next generation. So that's both a matter of how I practice my faith, my mindset in practicing it, what I focus on in practicing my faith, and also what I strive to do as a rabbi, which is ultimately to be a teacher of my faith and my received tradition.
I think that's a pretty good story for what it's worth. Don't let anybody tell you it's not exciting.
I appreciate that.
it's also a good segue into our next question, since you ended your remarks there with the connection between faith and social justice. And the topic that we've asserted for tonight is faith, culture, and anti-Semitism. And the impetus for that, the reason why we wanted to talk about was the hostage situation at Beth Israel Synagogue in Texas. But once we got to thinking about it, we realized that there are so many other incidents and events of anti-Semitism. And that led us to this question that I wanted to ask you tonight. Have you wrestled with your faith any differently or taken up new questions about your faith in the aftermath of that situation, or perhaps the murders at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I have to say that as I was thinking about the conversation tonight, it struck me that I haven't really wrestled with my faith any differently, in the past few years, or related to my faith really any differently in the past few years in light of all of this anti-Semitism. It's shaken my faith in America. It's shaken my faith in the environment in which we live. But one of the realities of being Jewish is that the hatred of Jews has always been a part of being Jewish. At least depending on how you define it. It's present in stories in the Bible, right? We just celebrated the holiday of Purim, which commemorates the events of the Book of Esther, and many Jewish people regard that as maybe one of the first instances, one of the clearest instances of what we regard as historical anti-Semitism is already present in the Bible. So this has always been a part of my kind of identity and self-understanding as a Jew. What's different, of course, is that for most of my life growing up, dangerous anti-Semitism seemed to mostly be a thing of the past. Or we talked about the Holocaust a lot growing up, and we talked about other kind of major examples throughout history of anti-Semitism, but they always kind of, even the Holocaust, which obviously is not that long ago, seemed like ancient history. Seemed like it was talking about another world altogether than the one that I knew, and so it seemed and to put a finer point on it, right, that the Holocaust was in the old world, and that world already by the time that I was growing up in the 80s and 90s had been supplanted by the vibrant democracy in Europe and Germany as a profoundly enlightened country. I often kind of joke today because I have a kind of conflicted feelings about some of the ways that some of the policies in the modern state of Israel, which is supposed to be a place of Jewish refuge, and is in a lot of ways. I have a lot of pride and love of the state of Israel, but but there are also ways that I'm really troubled by it, and so my wife and I, sometimes joke to each other that that really, are it may very well be that the only two places that Jews are now safe are Canada and Germany, for different reasons. And so it's one of those historical ironies. So to me, what it's shaken my faith in is the world in which I live as a Jew, but not so much as what it means to be Jewish in the first place. There are lots of explanations of anti-Semitism. I'm much more taken with Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of England, who said, we can't identify, what there is in Judaism that to explain anti-Semitism, because that blames the victim for the crime. And so I don't think that there's actually anything in Judaism that explains anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a phenomenon that emerged, I think, around and outside of Judaism in relation to the Jews as a people, but is not something really inherent about the Jews as a people or Judaism as a tradition. So, and just to, if this is not too circuitous, what I would say about it, theologically, in terms of my faith is, I have a very, I don't have a very otherworldly faith, if that makes any sense. My faith is a much more practical and anthropocentric in a lot of ways. I'm very taken by an approach to theology developed first by Alfred North Whitehead in the early 20th century, and then later Hartshorn and Cobb, called process theology, which sees God much more as a force within history, a force within reality, that invites us to the good, rather than a coercive force outside of reality. And so what that means to me is that anti-Semitism, I think, represents the rejection of God's lure, which is the language that the process theologians use. And Jewish tradition, as I see it, and my faith as I see it, is to try to follow God's lure as best we can toward more life, more justice, more inclusion, more peace. So to me, the way anti-Semitism shapes my faith is to say that we have more work to do. That's really all it says to me, is that there's just more of God's lure to follow. We need to keep on that path. The final thing I want to say about this, I know this is a long answer, but in the wake of the Tree of Life shooting, I re-encountered a really powerful essay by one of my favorite 20th century theologians named Abraham Joshua Heschel, who survived the Holocaust, escaped Germany really before the genocide began in earnest, and reestablished himself as a leading theologian here in America. But in 1936, I think it was, he gave a speech in Berlin to a conference of Quakers called The Meaning of This Hour. Really extraordinary speech. He adapted it in a couple different ways after that time too. But basically, he said the same thing. He said that the challenge of our time, the meaning of this moment, is that we've allowed too much space in the world for evil to creep in. We haven't made the world enough of a space for the indwelling of the divine presence. And he said, he put it this way, and it just haunts me. He says, either the world is an altar for the divine. This is not a direct quote. This is a paraphrase. Either the world is an altar for the divine, or it becomes a space capable of being invaded by demons. And so that to me is the faith question of this moment. Are we advancing God's presence in this world, or are we creating the empty space in which ideologies like anti-Semitism and other hateful modes of being can creep in? And so that to me is the essential faith question of the moment.
That is so helpful. And I think I have a lot of questions of my own, but I'm going to be responsible here and note that there are two questions from the audience sort of stemming from this that I don't want to lose track of. One, somebody's sort of asking you about Israel and criticizing it as potentially like any sort of criticism being considered anti-Semitic, especially regarding like issues around Palestine. So are Judaism, the faith and culture, and Israel, the state, inexorably intertwined is the one question.
Mm-hmm.
But then somebody is also asking why you think Canada is one of the only two safe spaces for Jews at the moment, so beyond Germany. So I don't know which one of those you want to tackle first, but I want to sort of raise those.
Yeah, so okay, I'll go with the last one first. I don't know, Canada, just looking at it, from the US, is, seems like a very like pleasant and harmonious and kind and polite place. And there haven't, I mean, obviously there's a history of anti-Semitism in Canada too. It's present and persistent there as it is in other places. But there hasn't been a massacre like Tree of Life in Canada that I can think of in recent memory. My wife is also Canadian, so that's part of why we talk about it and maybe even joke about it a little bit. My mom is also Canadian for whatever it's worth, but anyway, so that's why I don't know if it's honestly more safe. And the truth of the matter is, I don't feel really substantially more unsafe in America today than I did growing up. Like on a really like day to day, am I looking over my shoulder? Not quite, maybe a little bit more because I'm much more publicly Jewish than I may have been growing up, right? So, if they're going to come for anybody, they're going to come for the, mouthy Jew first. And so there is that aspect of it, but I think that that might be present even if Tree of Life and Colleyville and Poway or whatever, like all that didn't happen. So that's I feel very safe and truthfully, living in Richmond. That I have to say that, of course, is I think an indictment of our country, our world, of the reality and persistence of anti-Semitism. To answer the question about Israel, I think I need to answer a kind of broader question about anti-Semitism as I understand it. So if you want me to go there, I can.
Please, yeah, I think that's helpful. If you want to sort of start by telling us a bit more about how sort of you think about anti-Semitism as a cultural phenomenon, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and forgive me if this is, something that people have thought about and know, but I think that, to my mind, one of the best contemporary scholars on anti-Semitism is a scholar at Emory named Deborah Lipstadt, who is currently nominated as the White House envoy for anti-Semitism, which is in itself a kind of interesting thing. There's no White House envoy for Islamophobia. Maybe there should be, right? So that's its own thing. But Deborah Lipstadt is really an extraordinary scholar and should be confirmed to that post and is being really cynically and insanely held up by, I'll just, this is being recorded, you all know, but whatever. I'll just say it because you're not my congregation. It'll probably be half my congregation will be upset that I'll name this, but congressional Republicans. Okay, so Senate Republicans. So anyway, Deborah Lipstadt defines anti-Semitism as a set of hostile beliefs toward Jews as a whole that can manifest in different ways. So, okay, so that means that she sometimes says it is kind of sort of glibly that hating Jews more than is absolutely necessary, right? So in other words, you might not like me because I'm a jerk, right? And I might also happen to be Jewish, right? But it's anti-Semitic to think that, because I'm Jewish, I'm a jerk, right? Or that all Jews are jerks because I'm Jewish and a jerk, right? So it's a set of hostile beliefs toward Jews as a whole that can manifest in different ways, in individuals as attitudes, right? So I don't like Jews as a person, right? In culture as myth, ideology, folklore, and imagery, and that is present in a lot of ways. And in actions, so that can be social or legal discrimination, political mobilization against Jews, collective or state violence, which results in or is designed to distance, displace, or destroy Jews as Jews. All right, and so let's just go into that just a little bit more, that the core of those hostile beliefs is essentially conspiracy theory, and it's a really old conspiracy theory. So the Jewish people, and it basically goes something like this: the Jewish people have forged an international cosmopolitan alliance, which compels far more powerful entities to do our nefarious bidding. And that bidding invariably involves aiding Jews or Jewish interests at the expense of non-Jews or their interests. And since Jewish values and interests are often aligned with those of other marginalized groups like immigrants or racial minorities, anti-Semitism often goes hand in hand with other forms of bigotry, right? So just to put a finer point on it, right? The massacre at Tree of Life Synagogue is an illustration of that, right? The shooter believed that there was a vast global Jewish conspiracy to replace white civilization with Black and brown refugees and immigrants, right? And that's why he went into Tree of Life, to kill Jews. It is, right, it's present in when, white supremacists march in Charlottesville and say, the Jews will not replace us, right? That's what they mean, right? Because I when I heard it, I actually was like, what are they talking about, right? I didn't really understand this then, and it drove me to understand it further. So that's what they mean, that there's a Jewish conspiracy to genocide white people. Right, and the same thing motivated manifested in a different way, but the same thing motivated the terrorists who targeted Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville a few months ago. Right, he targeted the synagogue in Neutrality because he believed that Jews controlled the world, and if he could just find the right Jew, he could attain the political aim that he wanted to attain. Okay, so that's I think from my mind a helpful frame to talking about an assertion of whether and in what ways criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Okay, so I personally believe in two things that might sound contradictory, but are I think not. The first is that because Israel is a country like any other country, with relative strengths and weaknesses, relative perpetrating or responsible for relative justice and injustice like any other country, right? Criticism of Israel is perfectly justified. And I believe that. At the same time, right, I think that criticism of Israel bleeds into anti-Semitism in some of the following ways. The first is to implicate all Jews around the world in whatever injustices you believe are happening in Israel, right? So to target me as a Jew because Israel is a Jewish state, right, to implicate me in those injustices. That's number one. Number two is when Israel is uniquely singled out as a perpetrator of injustice, right? So now that can sort of dissolve into whataboutism, right, which often happens for those on the political right within the Jewish community, supporters of Israel, who they'll hear criticism of Israel and say, like, well, you're not saying the same thing about China. You're not, what about Saudi Arabia? Right? And my answer to that is yes, those injustices are injustices too, right? And we should call those out, but that doesn't mean that the injustices that we're talking about within Israel are not injustices themselves, right? So now, but there can be a way in which some critics of Israel only talk about injustices perpetrated by Israel, and I think that can be anti-Semitic. And finally, I do believe that rejection of the right of the state of Israel to exist altogether. Now, in what constitution it should exist, what borders, whatever, right? That to me is fair game, right? But rejection of Israel's right to exist altogether is, I think, anti-Semitic. And I think it's at least anti-Semitic in practice, because to eliminate the state of Israel would, I think, invariably result in the death or displacement of many, many Jews. So I think it's also anti-Semitic in principle, not just in practice. But that's what I would say. So to me, right, criticism of Israel is legitimate so long as we can operate under a few different assertions, right? One is that Israel isn't the only perpetrator of injustices in the world. And that we're going to try to be as fair as we can in identifying injustices as they exist in the world. Two, that the Jews have a legitimate historical claim to, that doesn't necessarily negate anybody else's legitimate historical claim, but the Jews have a legitimate historical claim to at least a portion of the land that constitutes modern day Israel, and a political right to be a self-governing people, to have sovereignty, and three, that the actions of the state of Israel, the policies of the state of Israel, the injustices perpetrated by the state of Israel are the responsibility of the state of Israel primarily, and not necessarily all world Jewry. Now that last one gets a little bit complicated because many Jews in America, elsewhere in the diaspora, do a lot of work to support the state of Israel, including some of those policies. So that one gets a little bit hairy, I recognize, but I think that there's much more nuance there than simply saying because somebody is Jewish, they are ipso facto implicated in every injustice that Israel perpetrates. In the same way that, like, just because I'm an American, I may have voted for a government that is making war somewhere, but that doesn't necessarily, and I therefore have some responsibility in it, but I'm not guilty necessarily of those injustices.
Yeah, no, I think this, I'm just going to follow up quick, Dave. But I think this, like, and you've already sort of said this in sort of your framing of where you sit within the broader Jewish tradition, right? Like, or, and I use tradition rather than faith, right? Because as you said, there are absolutely secular Jews who ethnically sort of identify, but aren't so much interested in faith or theological components of it. I just wanted to ask sort of a quick follow-up, because I think recognizing that Jews, even in Israel, aren't a monolith the way you were sort of gesturing towards, right? And so, like, I have a lot of friends who are like several generations in Israeli, right? And are very against what a lot of their government does. And in fact, when they came over and did study in America, struggled with American Jews more than other Americans, because it's often the American Jews who have been part of some of these Zionist movements and these sort of settlements that have increased the tension that was already there with Palestinians, right? Because there are Palestinian, not just Muslims, but Christians that we often forget to sort of put in that conversation. So I didn't know if you had any sort of like thing you might say to that briefly, but.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point for a few reasons. One is that, which is something that especially the American Jewish right is quick to point out, that Israel, at least Israel within the Green Line, and for if people aren't familiar with that term, that means basically the armistice line that existed after what Israel calls its War of Independence in 1948. That doesn't include areas that are now generally considered to be occupied Palestinian territory. So Israel within the Green Line is a vibrant, pluralistic democracy, with people that have many different passionately held opinions. And so therefore there are plenty of Israelis who disagree vehemently with the actions of their government. But one thing that exists also within the American Jewish right wing, especially when it comes to Israel, is a kind of irony. Let's call it irony instead of cynicism. That say to people like me, like we don't live there. We don't live in Israel. We don't send our children to the army to die in Israel's wars. We don't pay taxes there, right? We could move there and have a vote, but if we don't have a right to criticize the state of Israel from our vantage point here. Now, the irony of that, of course, is that plenty of people on the political right in America, both Jews and non-Jews for that matter,
correct,
have invested a lot of time, energy, and resources, people and financial, human and financial, into advancing right-wing politics within Israel. That includes expansion of settlements. It includes creeping annexation. It includes advancing the politicians who support those policies and who are, not in favor of things like creating a Palestinian state, who some of whom are what I would call Jewish supremacists, right? Which is a strange phenomenon that exists. But We can come back to that later if you want. But anyway, so you know, at the same time, they say like we don't get a say in what happens in Israel, and yet are devoting a lot of energy and resources into actually having a say in what happens and changing the facts on the ground, what happens in Israel. Those people also, by the way, don't have the same point of view about any other country and any other injustice, right? So it's the same people who say like the whataboutism, and say like, well, criticize Saudi Arabia. Say, okay, but the fact that you say that I should criticize Saudi Arabia means that as somebody who doesn't live there and, you know, whose kids don't serve in the army in Saudi Arabia should also have a say in what happens in Saudi Arabia. Number one, and number two, you know, they also don't have a problem with Israel investing resources in advancing a pro-Israel law. And now I don't think this is nefarious. I think other countries can and should and do fund movements within America to lobby for their country's interests in foreign policy. I mean, that happens. Whether or not it should happen maybe is a different question, right? But it does. So they don't seem to have a problem with Israel and Israelis having a say-so in what American policy should be, right? So that's let's call it irony.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, Rabbi, if we can go back to some of the things you said earlier about this culture of anti-Semitism. You did a quick historical gloss of it, and the way you were talking about the origins of this conspiracy theory, it made me think of a text that I've never read, but I've heard cited all the time, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I wondered if you could give us a little bit more elaboration about the historical foundations of anti-Semitism, the way you distinguished it both against the people and against the faith. And I mean, because I think we take it for granted that it was so much a part of the culture of Europe and of large parts of the world that America didn't know. So we're Americans, we're Christians, we're thinking of it from the distance of history. But can you give us a little bit more of a sense of how big of a phenomenon the culture of anti-Semitism was?
Or is? I mean, so
yes, of course.
Listen, I'm not I do have a undergraduate degree in history, but I wouldn't say that I'm a historian. So I'm not necessarily an expert on this topic. But you know what I would say is that anti-Semitism, as it's manifested in the modern world, I think has its roots in early Christianity. It has its roots in the way the early Christians both distinguished themselves from the Jews who didn't themselves become Christians, and also tried to claim the superiority of their approach to faith, their understanding of their faith over the Jews, right? So that turned that first of all othered the Jews, but also kind of turned the orientation toward the Jews into something somewhat demonic, right? That or at least as enemy, right? We were enemies of Christ, we were enemies of the Christian community, and so that eventually became present in public policy when Christianity was the dominant religion in first the Roman and Byzantine empires, and then in medieval Europe. It meant that those attitudes were reflected in both culture, right? How people saw Jews, but also in policies that also impacted the kinds of places Jews could live, the kinds of jobs, positions Jews could have, which so Jews were relegated to professions that were not considered to be reputable, honorable for Christians to hold, like money lending and money changing, which reinforced an image of Jews as or created an image of Jews as greedy, as money grubbing, and also as holding a lot of power, because people who had essentially a large stake in the financial system eventually came to have somewhat, or at least the impression of outsized influence. So all of these kind of feed into one another, right? But ultimately, at its core, right, is this idea that like the Jews are against Christendom, right, are against Christians, which becomes, right, the Jews are not like us. The Jews are a totally other kind of people, and want to destroy us, and us being defined as Europeans, although it also becomes part in some ways, different ways in the Islamic world too. The Islamic world, generally speaking, had a better relation. Jews had a better relationship with fared better in Islamic countries than in Christian ones. So all of this is kind of in the soup of the creation of modern Europe. And so again, the conspiracy theory at the heart of anti-Semitism is somewhat elastic, which means it can incorporate lots of different data points. It can, it can be present in a lot of different cultures. It can, but basically, like at its core, that's what it is, right? Jews are different than us. Jews are out to get us, right? Jews want to control the world, right? And so you mentioned the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That's probably the first instance of, or the most pernicious, I'd say, instance of anti-Semitism in modernity. And it's also apropos of the moment that we're in, a really one of the best known examples of how dangerous Russian propaganda is. So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion essentially is, and nobody knows exactly who wrote it, but probably someone in a position of power in 19th century Russia composed this document that claims is sort of like a discovered text that was written by the Elders of Zion, right, Jewish leaders, that uncovers the Jewish plot to take over the entire world, and it's released as sort of like an expose, right? And so people, it's disinformation, but people take it as real information, and because this is modernity now, it has tremendous legs. It gets carried over to the United States. Henry Ford embraces it, and becomes sort of leading voice of perpetrating this anti-Semitic life. Eventually, it's debunked as a fake, but not fast enough for it to not have gotten into the hands of many people, which, by the way, includes influencing. Being highly influential in Germany, which already has a long history of anti-Semitism, but is, among the, you listen to or read Hitler's speeches and the theme or segments of his book, right? Many of the themes that he evokes around the Jews are almost directly lifted from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? That there is a Jewish, and you might add, Bolshevik conspiracy, right, to ally themselves, right, and take over the whole world, right? And so that what we need is to rid Europe of basically the disease of Jewishness, or else it will kill us.
And so, okay, coming out of that culture, then that Christianity has been a part of perpetuating, what do you feel Christians could do to become better allies with Jewish people in fighting anti-Semitism?
It's a great question. St. Paul's actually had a great scholar in residence a couple months ago who spoke about this. Now I can't remember her name. She's at Vanderbilt, I think.
Yeah.
Do you remember who I'm talking about?
Amy
Jo Levine.
Amy Jo Levine.
Kelly, yeah.
Yeah. All I could get was AJ. So
yeah. Amy Jo Levine, thank you. It was on the tip of my tongue. I went to one of her talks. I thought it was great, right? So I think that part of it is learning how to reread Christian scripture without the centuries-long gloss of Christian supremacy, of supersession, right? That the theology that Christianity came to supersede Judaism, without the sort of latent, even if it's unnamed, Jew hatred that has been present in the long history of Christianity. It's not ubiquitous necessarily, right? And I have lots of some of my best friends are Christian. I have lots of Christian friends, and I know St. Paul's as a community is very committed to living out this practice of trying to anti-Semitize Christian tradition. So part of that is kind of like learning how to peel back those layers. So that was a great start, or a great part of that work. So that's a big piece of it. Learning about, which also is related to learning more about Judaism, if you to the extent that you can. This again is a great start. I know St. Paul's is preaching to the choir here in a lot of ways, but because St. Paul's I think is really a model for this. I think that you really strive for this, to be a great community partner, and part of that comes with getting to know Jews, getting to know Jewish communities, and getting to know Judaism for what it is. And then I think there's something kind of broader that needs to happen, which is eradicating the conditions that enable anti-Semitism to thrive in the first place, right? So anti-Semitism tends to rise first, like I said before, in tandem with other forms of bigotry, right? So when you see white supremacy and white nationalism manifesting as hatred toward African Americans, as hatred toward LGBTQ people, as hatred toward women, as hatred toward indigenous people, whatever it is, right? Or as hatred of Jews, right? Pushing back against it, calling that out, is really, really important, no matter who it manifests against. So that's a piece of it. Part of the conditions also are the socioeconomic conditions that produce anti-Semitism, right? So anti-Semitism tends to emerge. Heschel pointed this out, right? If we're not advancing, if we're not making this world a place where God's sovereignty is realized, it becomes a breeding ground for evil, right? So that means building a more just society, to put it in very stark terms, right? And if we're not doing that, then we're seeding ground that is fertile soil for anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry to flourish. And finally, and this one's really important, and this is the one that I've really kind of become most aware of in our time, are the ways in which it manifests in our politics, right? So anti-Semitism flourishes when leaders, whether they are true believers, like someone like Hitler, right, or just calculating, ally themselves with anti-Semites, refuse to denounce anti-Semites, evoke anti-Semitic tropes or other kind of white supremacist tropes. We need to root those kind of leaders entirely out of our politics, and also do whatever we can to oppose them and to call them out where they emerge elsewhere around the world, right? I mean, we're confronting this right now in Russia. I don't know if Vladimir Putin is an anti-Semite, although it wouldn't surprise me. But certainly his worldview, his orientation toward Russia, the reconstituting the Russian Empire, his sense of threat of the purity of Russians, right? All of those things evoke old anti-Semitic tropes or similar to them, right? So this is not just an American phenomenon, this is an international phenomenon. And so I think that we need to fight on all of those levels.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that, Christine, before we close out? Is this that, because you mentioned your disappointment, or I don't know what the word, but about being American after these anti-Semitic events, your reaction was, it made me disappointed, or I don't know, upset about what America does. And I kind of wondered if we can ask the same question about being allies against anti-Semitism from the perspective of Americans. And I wonder this whenever I drive out, into the country and I see huge crosses along the side of the highway, or when I hear prayers in public, in government spaces, Christian prayers, or there's so much when you don't really think about it, but that we narrate American life from the perspective of Christianity so often. And I never really thought about that until I started thinking about this conversation we're having tonight, and I started, kind of reading more about it. Is there something more that Americans can do, whether they identify as Christian or not, to be allies against anti-Semitism?
I really appreciate that question. So my answer might be a little bit idiosyncratic. I mean, I think that, it's not entirely about Jews and anti-Semitism. What you're pointing to is that America is not a Christian nation. The founders may have been mostly Christians and may have utilized some Christian language and employed ideas with Christian heritage in the founding of our country, but it was never founded to be a Christian nation, right? We actually have a place just here downtown in Richmond that celebrates the Virginia Charter of Religious Freedom, which was the model for the First Amendment of the Constitution, in which the government cannot establish a religion or prevent the free exercise thereof, right? So we are by design at least religiously pluralistic country, which means that that ought to be reflected in our public life and in our civic life. Now, I don't think that means that Christianity has no place in our public life or in our civic life. I want there to be proud, vibrant, joyous expressions of Christianity in our culture, because there are a lot of Christians in our culture, and the free exercise thereof should not be denied to them either, right? Where it gets tricky is the ways in which it might inhibit the free exercise of my own tradition or other people's tradition, or look like or feel like the government is preferencing or prioritizing one religious tradition over another. So, this is the first year we're sending our kids to public school, and I didn't go to public school growing up, so I didn't really fully appreciate this. I had a much more laissez-faire point of view about this before I sent my kids to public school. But there's a lot of Christmas in public school, and there's a lot of Valentine's Day and St. Patrick's Day, and I'm hoping not, but probably Easter in public school. And I get it, right? That's some of those things are kind of part of our civic life, part of our public life. There's most of the kids in the school are Christian, and that's what their families are talking about anyway. So I don't think that the answer is to totally rid public school of any manifestation of any religious tradition. But I think that there is a way in which the ubiquity of those celebrations in public school can minimize, right? Otherize those who don't celebrate them, and also can blind those who do celebrate those holidays and other practices, right? To not, whether it's the presence of people of other backgrounds in that space specifically, or the reality that there are people not like them outside, right? So let's say there's actually no Jewish kid in a class. Does that mean that everything should be Christmas all December long? No, I don't think so, right? So I think that being mindful of that, it's a term that I didn't know a lot growing up, and I'm hesitant to use because I recognize that as a straight white cisgender male, this doesn't quite apply to me. But I think that in a way, those I would call those microaggressions. There are ones that, for the most part, I've kind of learned to just deal with and make my peace with, right? If I'm in a interfaith space and somebody praise in Jesus's name, I kind of shrug it off because it's just something I'm used to. But should people be mindful of that, right? Just as I am mindful in those spaces to try both to honor my tradition while also not expressing things that might make other people in other traditions uncomfortable, right? So like I think about it, right? So the dominant culture should think about it too, maybe even more so.
Yes, agreed. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I want to keep having a conversation, but I do realize that we're approaching the end of our time. So I'm also want to thank everybody out there who has joined us this evening. And I wanted to bring to your attention our final sort of faith and culture series conversation that will be on Wednesday, May 11th, which is faith, culture, and reproductive rights. And we will be having Jamie Manson join us. Jamie is the president of Catholics for Choice. For over 15 years, she has been a thought leader and advocate in the field of women's equality and reproductive rights in the Catholic Church and the public square. For 12 years, she was a columnist at the National Catholic Reporter, where she was one of the few openly LGBTQ journalists in the Catholic media in the world. She was an often solitary voice for reproductive freedom and justice, and was one of the first to sound the alarm about the right-wing push for religious freedom. Her combined expertise in Catholicism and sexual ethics was first formed during her studies at Yale with her mentor, Margaret Farley. She's edited and wrote the introduction to Changing Questions, Explorations in Christian Ethics, a collection of writings by Margaret Farley. She's also published op-eds in the New York Times, NBC Think, Miss Magazine, and Rewire, and has been featured in dozens of media outlets, including recently Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, NPR, the LA Times, and CNN. She is the recipient of the Sister Teresa Kane Woman of Vision and Courage Award. So I hope you all will be able to join us again on May 11th. And now Rabbi Knopf has graciously offered to bless the end of our time together. So thank you so much for this conversation and for your time, Rabbi Knopf. It's been such an absolute pleasure. So thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for the great questions and conversation. And, it's an occupational hazard, I guess, of a rabbi. If I sucked up too much of the air, I apologize. But what I love about St. Paul's is that we're in relationship together. And I'm always thrilled to be able to continue the conversation and fellowship with everybody there. And the two of you, thank you for being such great hosts in this. And Reverend Kelly too, who facilitated this. So I thought that as a concluding prayer, I would offer actually the prayer for peace that we recite every week in my congregation, and that one has a major urgency that prayer feels like it has a major sense of urgency in this moment. It also feels really appropriate for this space, which to me is really a peace building space. So I'm grateful for that too. God, thank you for the opportunity to gather together as siblings and friends, pursuers of peace and lovers of peace. May we see the day when war and bloodshed cease and a great peace will embrace the whole world, when nation no longer threatens nation and the human family will never again know war. Let all who live on earth realize we have not come into being to hate or to destroy, but to praise, to labor, and to love. God of compassion, bless the leaders and peoples of all nations with the power of compassion, fulfilling the promise conveyed in Scripture, that peace will be brought to the land, and all shall lie down with none to terrify them. That justice and righteousness will flow like a mighty stream, and that God's peace will fill the earth as the waters fill the sea. And let us say, Amen.